I'm sure the family would want me to begin by thanking everyone for coming here, and I'm sorry that it's standing room only to the south. But what a wonderful testament to Peter's life and Peter's influence on all of us that this place is so packed. These are my introductory notes, and again, if you did not get a program, there are some over here. Here we are, hoping we found words worthy of our good friend, hoping to share, if only for an hour, his family's burden of grief. In a 2013 keynote address to the Philological Association of the Carolinas, Peter had occasion to recount some of the highlights of his career, dismissing the whole thing as checkered and undistinguished. Keep doing that. And also, it will help if you are familiar with Monty Python. I will touch on only enough of that address to let you judge that for yourself, and will read 2 short passages from it because I can't not. During what he called his brief but, quote, ironic career in the British Army, Peter taught a survival course in German to British soldiers, and in so doing discovered his Tao as an educator. As an undergraduate, he studied Russian at the Royal Military Academy and then Arabic at Durham University, and traveled widely through North Africa and the Middle East. One morning, having spent the night on a beach in Lebanon, he was awakened by a rat running across his chest in pursuit of a crab. Quote, "The creatures dueled," he remembered, "in the manner of the knights at the bridge in the Monty Python movie. The rat would dash in, amputate a limb, and retreat before the crab could bring its heavy weapon to bear. Eventually the crab, though still full of fight, had only one limb left, by which the rat dragged it under a nearby hut." For 5 years, Peter taught the history of English at the University of Oviedo, along the way collecting specialties in philology, dialectology, and comparative literature. He delighted in the Spanish springtimes, remembering, quote, "In the Galician Northwest, wheat was gathered in stooks at harvest time, and winnowing machines flung a mist of blonde husks into the sunshine. And everywhere, all through summer, there were village fiestas full of music and beautiful, amorous young folk who came back from college to celebrate life." It's an operative term today. He completed his doctoral dissertation on D.H. Lawrence at Exeter, and by 1982 had taken a job at Kenyon College in Ohio, where he met Roberta, then moved with her to teach in Jordan, where they had James and Jasmine. In 1992, he accepted a position at FMU, teaching world literature and mythology, and moved into the office next to mine. As his neighbor, I quickly came to appreciate Peter very much. Passing his open door, I would frequently observe him patiently leaning into open text with a student, or rehearsing aloud his French, German, Italian, or Old Provençal. Over time, our relationship grew into an almost daily duel of wits, for which I was woefully unarmed. He would pepper our conversations with passages from Latin or Greek or references to obscure text, and was then gracious enough to explain them to me. My ripostes involved having my very worst advisees reassigned to him. He once stood in my office door and shook his fist. We found ourselves deeply amusing. On an almost daily basis, we would share unprofessional and wholly inappropriate asides of which we were deeply ashamed and then would always giggle. He had a great giggle. Once, for instance, he recounted with great giggly glee that morning he discovered a student standing outside my office reading my many rejection letters. They easily covered the entire wall. Peter stood beside the student and marveled with him at my many failures and said, "Really something in it." To which the student asked, "Has he ever had anything accepted?" Whereupon Peter replied, No, but he keeps trying. Several weeks before he died, Cheryl and I visited him, as did some of you, at his home. He lay on the couch and was painfully thin, but his blue eyes were still twinkling. We spoke frankly about his cancer, from the early symptoms to the treatments, to his decision to let nature run its course. We speculated about his future, which he admitted was blurry, though he said he was not the least bit afraid and had decided that Dylan Thomas's plea to his father to not go gentle into that good night was strictly rubbish. When at last it was time to say our goodbyes, I stood and bent over him and took his hand in mine, and I said, "I am so proud that you're my friend." Whereupon his eyes clouded a bit, and he squeezed my hand, and he said the most wonderful thing, "My boy." That visit was fortunately not the end of our conversations. Cheryl and I soon embarked on a 2-week journey out west, during which Peter and I exchanged almost daily text. What follows is a transcript of those conversations, edited for brevity and comedy. I began by reminding him of a speech we had attended by one of our previous presidents, who, while speaking, got himself pretty lathered up. On the way out of the auditorium, Peter and I happened to fall in next to each other, whereupon Peter raised his eyebrows and remarked, "The president found his speech very moving." I told him, in my text, "That's a line I have pilfered many, many times." "May you live and prosper to pilfer it many more," he replied, "but please see my agent concerning royalty payments." I told him royalties would accrue over the course of my long and notorious pilfering career and be paid in one lump sum when I felt I had pilfered my last. "My estate manager is rubbing her hands with anticipation," he said. "How much do you think it is so far? Should I have a special line in my will for posthumous projects?" I said, "You'd be amazed." He said, "Woohoo, riches at last. Pilfer on, amigo." Several days later, he wrote that Roberta and Jasmine were going to, quote, "take me to a pig pickin'." Harpy-footed furies. That phrase, it turns out, comes straight out of the second book of Paradise Lost and refers specifically to mythological creatures charged with punishing the damned. I replied, "Good, go get you some pig flesh. What's the worst that could happen?" Hours went by before he replied, and I admit I got worried until finally he wrote, "I survived." I replied, "I lost that bet." And he replied, "Perhaps." We reminisced, of course, about the many pancake breakfasts the family Whelan treated us to. Those were magnificent Sundays filled with laughter and rangy conversations, the primary beneficiary of which was my son, whose privilege it was to sit at a table with James and Jasmine and others in the constellation of the brightest lights we knew. Later, I sent him a photograph taken in a restaurant in San Antonio of my nephew and his 2 teenage sons, and we remarked how blonde and chiseled they were, alluding briefly to their fitness as Aryans. He called me un Schweinhund. After an overnighter at hospice, he complained about his most recent meal, a glop of egg, a glop of squash, and a glop of, quote, something nameless. I sent him a picture of the huevos rancheros I just polished off, as well as a picture of a bumper sticker I'd seen that reminded me of him. It read, "How am I driving? How does this engine even work? How can a loving God cause such heartache?" He replied, "How can a loving God make my feet itch and keep me awake? Or plug you with scorpions?" I had no idea what that meant. Turns out it's from the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 12. I had no way of knowing that then, so I replied, "When you get to the other side, find out and report back." He said, "I believe that may against the rules, but these days, who cares?" I could tell by now he was fading. His replies were coming more slowly and contained uncharacteristic typos, or sometimes didn't make much sense. Or maybe they made complete sense, and I couldn't possibly know it. At any rate, that seemed the right time to tell him how much it meant to me that he squeezed my hand and said, "My boy." He wrote back, "They gave me a Valium this morning. I can't think very clearly." I accused him of deliberately evading anything smacking of sentimentality and would not allow him to retract it. Later he wrote, "That warm and loving hand clasp was fully understand, I promise you. And actually, I would have loved a hug, but I couldn't stand up." I told him I was afraid of dropping you. He said, "I've been like a father to you. A real son would have seized the old man's skin and bones and lifted him into his filial embrace." And then he said he was knocking off for the night. I said, "I hope you sleep well. I'm going to miss you." "Is it too soon for that?" He wrote, "Never too soon to contemplate the effects of my demise on your life." I said, "I started that weeks ago, but sleep well, and flights of angels." He wrote, wait, I'm not dead yet." And I had to reply, "Don't be a baby, get on the wagon." "Heartless brute," he said in all caps, "are you above contemplating the effects of my demise on my life?" The next day I wrote, "Is it too soon to say nice things to you?" He said, "Never too soon to say nice things to me, but it is too soon to say only nice things to me." And then the Latin, "De mortuis nil nisi bonum," concerning the dead, never speak ill. I said, "Thank you for that translation." Nice thing for today, I actually appreciate the way you've never assumed I'm your intellectual equal. Let's keep that bar low. He said, "I've learned over the years how many Yanks per square mile struggle with Latin." Upon returning from another trip to hospice and complaining yet again about the food, he wrote, "Cras amet, qui numquam amavit, quique amavit cras amet." When no translation forth came, I took a stab at it myself. "My hovercraft is full of eels." And he wrote back, "Damn it, so is mine." This went on for about another hour until I said, "Go to bed." Our last few exchanges had to do with what an awful pet, however affectionate an Antechinus would make, and whether Percocets were related to marmosets, and so on, until he confessed he no longer could type out messages. He had to voice them, he said, and play aloud my responses, so perhaps I should watch what I say because he wasn't always alone. Whereupon I responded, in all caps so it might be loud, with a short, well-known profane imperative involving a duck. I sent him 3 or 4 more texts about our journey, but received no replies, as he had already begun his. I harangued him with updates on my whereabouts, a Scottish pub outside Memphis, a football game with Ken Kitts in Alabama, but no word came until Sunday morning, November 3rd, when Roberta called. She told me that, as sometimes happens with hospice patients, he did not go gentle into that good night. She told me that, in his final hours, he asked if his life had been good and if his friends really liked him. Well, here we are, Peter. Judge for yourself. About that passage, cras amet, qui numquam amavit, quique amavit cras amet. I had to look it up. It's the opening line of a 3rd century lyric attributed to Catullus, titled "The Vigil of Venus," which is a celebration of the arrival of spring. It is also the last line of John Fowles' The Magus, about an idealistic young Englishman who leaves his country to teach in distant lands. It means, let those love now who have never loved. Let those who have loved love yet again. Meredith.
Good afternoon. My name is Meredith Love, and I'm the chair of the English department, and I had the pleasure of working with Peter for 12 years. I don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of the faculty lounge to the English department. It's where I made some of my first friends at Francis Marion as we gathered for lunch over our leftovers, our canned soups, ham sandwiches, and if Peter was there, sardines. And Peter was often there with Becky and Pam and Chris and Mary McNulty and John Sutton and others. We talked about classes and students and research, but we also told a lot of stories. We talked about our families, and we laughed a lot. In 2007, I was expecting my first child, and it was a really happy time, and everyone in the department was so excited for me and was so supportive and generous. And over lunch, people were giving parenting advice and talking about their experiences with kids. And Peter knew exactly what he was going to get for our new baby. It was, of course, a book. And apparently, this book was out of print. But Peter managed to get his hands on a used copy, and he gave it to us. And it was the very first book on our baby's bookshelf. Edward Lear's The Complete Verse and Utter Nonsense. I remember thinking that this must be like a super important book that was going to, impart amazing wisdom to our children that I could not possibly, come up with myself. And I remember how happy he was to give us the book and how he emphasized that it was very, very important that we read this book to our baby. It included poems like this. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard." And this last stanza, which might sound a little familiar from The Owl and the Pussycat. "Dear pig, are you willing to sell for 1 shilling your ring?" said the piggy. "I will." So they took it away and were married next day by the turkey who lives on the hill. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon. And hand in hand on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the moon. The moon, the moon, they danced by the light of the moon. If you know this book, you know that it is wacky and weird and funny and strange. It's full of made-up words and tongue twisters and weird illustrations. And when I was looking about these poems, it occurred to me how very Peter the gift was. Because Peter was fun, and he was silly, and he loved, loved, loved language. And he shared this love with his many students. Many of you may not know this, but for 23 years, nearly every graduate of our secondary English education program took a class from Peter. These students have gone on to teach across South Carolina, and they are teaching poetry and mythology and world literature and all kinds of great stories. And I think it's very possible that they're sharing with their students the important idea that language is fun and playful and strange and perfectly lovely. This year, I'm happy to say that our department will give an alumni award for the very first time, and it will be the Peter Whelan English Alumni Award. And when we give this award in the coming years, we promise to be joyful and maybe even a bit silly when we talk about Peter and how he loved us and all of the world's words. Thank you.
My name is Ted Whisnut. I was a part-time, full-time English instructor at Francis Marion for 14 years. I still don't know what part-time, full-time means. It has something to do with health insurance. And I'm honored today to speak to you at this celebration of the life of Peter Whelan. I'm also aware that almost everyone in here could share many things that I don't know and many things that would be important to you and your relationship with Peter. In the mid-1990s, I would say our relationship was mostly casual because I was only teaching the occasional night course at Francis Marion. I had just finished graduate school at Francis Marion. But once during that early period, Peter and several members of the FMU English department came to Marion High School where I was working. I had picked up the germ of an idea from Philip Gardner, who is right over there, about a writing project, and I could see many things that Philip was telling me that would be of a lot of use to a lot of high school kids. And so I wanted a writing center of our own. And so at the time, the chairman was Robert Parham and his able companion, Warren Westcott, and I sat down, and they wrote it, and my input was that I knew the chairman of the Commission on Higher Education as a personal friend and fishing partner, and so that was my offering. And after they made the presentation that day and left the campus, I will point out at this point, the project never got off the ground, but nonetheless, a teacher from a classroom near mine dropped by and said she had enjoyed the program. Then she added, you know, there's two of those guys I've seen over there when I was taking a recertification course in education. That one fellow, the one with the long white hair and tight jeans, is he an English professor? He looks like one, but he also looks like he should be in a rock band. And the other guy with the accent, what does he teach? I said, well, they're both English professors, but you're right. Philip Gardner is in a rock band, one of many he's been in, and Peter Whelan does have an accent. Peter's from the UK, and I'm not sure how many languages he speaks, but it's more than a few. And I've often wondered, and I've asked you now, what do you think he might have thought of our Southern dialect? I learned more about Peter when I left Marion High School to teach at FMU and later serve as the student teacher supervisor. I'm familiar with some of those graduates that Meredith mentioned, and I can tell you I used to occasionally, after they had been student teachers for a while, I'd ask them to a little exit thing after they had completed. I said, tell me who your professors who influenced you at Francis Marion. And no one could limit it to one person. But I'd say Peter made a fair showing in most of them. And I would also say that some of the people who said he was an influential professor did not take his course, which is left unexplained. I did read a thing once, and I'm not sure when I read this, but in a student newspaper at Francis Marion, he was featured as the spotlight professor. And during the interview, he asked a question about his teaching, and I'll always remember it because he told the reporter, my job is not to make my students comfortable. My job is to make them think. And it was this belief in critical thinking and reading, as well as in composition, that Peter believed led to better educated people. I think there is a quotation taken from his belief in good books somewhere in that program you're looking at or have looked at. And I thought that was good enough that I passed it along to every one of those student teachers that I mentored. And some of them didn't need mentoring. They just needed me to show up and check off the boxes. But some did. Some had it twice. Peter was also a very sly and slippery provocateur. He enjoyed a bit of practical joking among his peers. I would say his fake spats with John Tuttle were legendary. And I sometimes wondered if maybe students wandering by the copy room or in and out of the English office would wonder, are these guys really serious about this? And is he really listening to that? He also had a really prodigious appetite for a man his size. I can also say that about the former chairman who gave me a job at Francis Marion, Dr. Chris Johnson. I've never seen two small men who could eat so much. I think Chris Johnson probably owns the record at the Scott's Barbecue in Hemingway for the most barbecue eaten while his mouth was on fire. So it was pretty interesting. It was always fun, though, as Meredith said, to be in the faculty lunch area at Founders Hall on days when Peter prepared his special lunch. He would enter the area quietly and without fanfare. He would produce a large plate and a large bag of fresh spinach. Then, with something of a flourish, he would pry open a tin of bristling sardines, spread the spinach onto the plate and dump the tiny fish on top, add the olive oil as a dressing for it all. Then, the responses were always the same. No, Peter, no. Marcia Taylor would run for the hills. We wouldn't see her for a day or two. And then someone would always remark, this place will smell like those sardines for weeks. And Peter also knew a great deal about kings and queens of England and other royalty throughout Europe and beyond. I don't know how he got all that in his head, but I have come to believe his favorite king was King Oscar II. And here he is. And I did a little research on this guy. I like his mustache. In 1902, he gave permission to a Norwegian and Sweden canning company that they could use his image. And so this is royal sardines. And so I'm going to give this tonight to Roberta, and someday I'm going to drop by and ask if we can eat them. I'm a big sardine lover too, but in western North Carolina, where I'm from, they're mostly eaten out of a tackle box in a lake, right like that one right there. Peter made much more of a fanfare than I did. By the way, I held up the can as a student teacher supervisor. This is what's called a visual aid. You have to have one of those. I guess now a visual aid would be their phones. I'm not sure. Okay. So just last week, I poured my own can of sardines over my own homegrown lettuce. Who would buy it in the store? Okay? And Susan, my wife, who's sitting right over there, insisted that I enjoy it on the patio of my work shed. So I did. But finally, there's another association with Peter I have enjoyed for the last several years. It sort of started for me not too long before the COVID. You know, we used to date everything in South Carolina from Hurricane Hugo. But now it's before COVID, before the pandemic. Okay, but Peter may not be the founder of the Lizard's Thicket Thursday Breakfast and World Problems Forum, but he is surely one of the founders. Okay, and I'm the newest member, and the other two members are retired neurosurgeon Ken Cameron, they're right over here, and retired Florence One educator Martin Smith, who's right over here. We generally sit in the same booth, which is close to the exit door, because our opinions vary significantly from those in there. And I think it's safe to say that the views of our problems and our words don't match up completely with that clientele. Martin, who's he'll be very quiet tonight, I don't know why, but he will often be sort of rowdy. And Ken's job is to hold him in place. But the wait staff at Lizard's Thicket, they're very kind to us. I guess it's a little bit like, you know, it's sort of like a temporary nursing home or something. I'm not sure what it's like. But almost weekly, these animated discussions, if you look around Lizard's Thicket, heads pop up. The closer it got to the election, more heads popped up. And now, at our booth, most of the heads are down. Anyway, the wait staff is very patient. They're very kind to us. And one of those waitresses, Nicole DeWitt, is here tonight. So thank you for coming. I know Peter would be pleased. And when they learned of Peter's, all of them, they learned of his illness and his poor prospects, they were really touched. Would you say, Ken? I'd like to close what I'm going to do today with two poems from another close friend of Peter, who could not be here tonight, although he really, really wanted to, and I had a long telephone conversation with him, Ken Autry. And this first poem, well, I went through everything that I have, a lot of the books that Philip Gardner's written, a lot of the books of Joe Angela Edwins, got a lot of the books of this, that, and the other professors, but everything I had of Peter didn't seem appropriate for what I wanted to do. So Peter said, Ken said, let me look through my stuff. So he sent me two things I'd never read before. And before I do this, though, I think we really ought to give a shout out to Bill Wilhide. In a moment when Roberta needed him most, he packed up that couple, Peter and Roberta, carried them to Waynesville, North Carolina, a place very close to my heart. And I texted Peter, I said, you be on the lookout for those moose. Except I meant elk. And when they drove up in the yard, the elk were waiting on them. And I said, they're loud, aren't they? And he said, very. So anyway, this is about something that doesn't just apply to Peter. It probably applies to anyone who's ever taught in any class, in any subject matter. It's called First Day. In the building with new carpet, my students pull crisp notebooks from their packs, ready for a fresh start. After they introduce themselves, I say I want everyone to succeed, everyone to make an A. That's my dream, just as it is theirs. The textbooks crack like kindling as they open them. This is the sound I hear when I'm laying the fire before touching the match to the ready under. Turning pages whisper like thin flames taking hold before long. The room fills with smoke. I squint to memorize their quizzical faces while fanning the blaze. I have laid up a stack of good oak I hope will last through winter, forming a bed of coals that will keep, then flare anew each day we meet in this cold room. When the class ends, they rise with their packs, ready to move on, and I'm left to tend the fire. I bank it for the night, talking to myself and praying the rain will hold off. The second one is at the celebration of Peter's 50th birthday. It's called, instead of Whelan, the title is Wheeling, a reference to cycling, of course. Wheeling at 50. And this is something that Ken doesn't do frequently. This poem rhymes a lot. Peter, Peter, I hadn't a clue that you were about to reach 52. 2 half-century boys already this year. Pop the champagne corks, ice down the beer. I'm startled, Peter, and here's why. I had thought you were so much older than I. It's not that you look it, never mind the gray hair, it's because of your wisdom, which is known everywhere. Even in Japan, the land of Zen mystics, they know of your talent in literature and linguistics. Your physical prowess, they've not heard of that, but I'm surely they'd envy your 11% body fat. As I told our good buddy Warren recently, it's not all bad when you're aging decently. It's the indecent stuff that will do you in. So keep that in mind as you're writing your Schwinn. I bet Schwinn's not an easy word to write. May today bring you blessings. From Roberta, a kiss. From James, a poem much better than this. From Jasmine, a hug and a fragrant bouquet. From your students, a show of brilliance all day. And your colleagues, how can we measure your worth? Of your comments incisive, your hard work, your mirth? We can't. That's a given, so I'll just give a shout. Peter Whelan is 50. Now the word has gone out. Thank you.
I'm Christopher Johnson, and apparently, Ted, I'm hungry. Thank you, Roberta, Jasmine, and James for inviting me to be part of this celebration. Thank you, John, for organizing this event. And most especially, thank you, Jeff, for hosting us in this beautiful facility. Peter would have loved the natural beauty of this place. Roberta also mentioned that the setting is particularly appropriate because it's on a highway that Peter frequently rode, sometimes with her and sometimes with his cycling chums. Peter was, as we all know, a spectacular athlete. When I first met him, he was a competitive runner. Later, he focused on cycling, often riding more than 100 miles a day. Now, I don't want to be immodest, but there were times I kept up with Peter on these very roads. In fact, once, not far from here, I passed him. There are some uncharitable sorts, Ted, who might note that Peter was on his bicycle, I was on a 650cc motorcycle, but I hung right in there, at least until I had to stop for gas. In truth, cycling, at least the exhausting sort that Peter enjoyed, was not something that we shared. Instead, my best memories of Peter involve food. When we moved to Florence, Peter and Roberta were the first folks to have us over. It was one of those unusual September Saturdays when the weather is cool enough to sit outside. Roberta had made some delicious chili, and we sat in the backyard of the old house on McQueen Street. Jasmine and James, I am sure you don't remember that afternoon. It was long ago. Jasmine, you had not yet become a cello virtuoso. James, you were still to be a master of martial arts. You were just little kids, maybe 7 or 8, probably reading Dostoevsky for the very first time. But you gave us the dirt on Florence District 1, and you made us feel at home. The Whelans made the Johnsons feel very welcome indeed, and we will always be grateful for that. Thank you. I also remember the many dining adventures Peter, John, and I undertook during our many trips to the annual Modern Language Convention. For those who don't teach English, let me just say a word or two about the MLA meeting. It's hell. Imagine a large urban convention center, but it's not filled with fun-loving party types, Rotarians, Legionnaires, Carmelite nuns. No, we're talking about 10,000 English professors, a veritable seat of pomposity, puns, and worn tweed. Even the servers in the restaurants were angry, and you can't blame them. I mean, how many times could one person explain that, yes, the tofu is ethically harvested, but no, I don't think the chickpeas are locally sourced. It's a terrible week for everyone, especially the graduate students who stand nervously in the hallways awaiting their interviews, wearing poorly fitting business attire and smelling of loneliness, malnutrition, and vanishing dreams. But that was not our lot. We were on the other side of those hotel doors. We were interviewers, and we had the name badges to prove it. In truth, when John, Peter, and I first began going to MLA, we didn't know what we were doing. We scheduled way too many interviews, and we barely gave ourselves time to breathe. Now, if John were telling this story, he would no doubt recall an evening when I was late for an interview, having attended a cocktail party hosted by my graduate program, and then tried nonchalantly to join the conversation while hiding a very large bottle of mediocre scotch under my coat, only to have said bottle fall from my grasp, bounce off the bed, and roll next to the candidate. If Peter were here, he'd verify the story and recall our amusement when we saw an X-ray image of that same bottle, which John had somehow managed to fit into his carry-on baggage. TSA, at least in those days, was perfectly okay with playwrights running liquor. In time, we got better at it, and we learned the importance of a good meal after a long day. We also learned to let Peter pick the restaurants. John tried it one time. He found, and this will surprise no one, a Mexican restaurant. The food was excellent, but he must have lit 5 packs of matches the next day as we tried to interview in that cramped, poorly ventilated room. Peter, on the other hand, was the Indiana Jones of restaurants, and we gladly went along for the ride. There was this particularly memorable evening in Chicago. John, I think you had made plans to go to the theater, and Peter made reservations at a Greek restaurant. That afternoon, he asked me if I'd ever had authentic Greek food. Well, I was a bit put off. I may have come to South Carolina by way of Missouri, but I didn't just fall off the turnip wagon. Good Dr. Whelan, I thought to myself, I would thank you to remember that I'm quite cosmopolitan. Why, I have enjoyed most of the menu items at Florence's own Town Hall restaurant. I know my heroes from my feta cheese, by gum. So the server gave us the menus, all in Greek. Not that coiny stuff, Mark, that you learned in seminary, nor that Attic crap, Matt, that philosophers like you like to read. No, real Greek, the language of hungry Mediterranean people. Looking at those inscrutable characters, I wondered, how do these people write chicken? Peter, ever gracious, ever helpful, said, Chris, these restaurants like to serve family style. Would it be okay if I ordered for both of us? It was, of course, and we had a feast. There was new wine with every dish. I think we had octopus served 5 different ways, all wonderful. Peter's choice of restaurants was always unexpected, sometimes a bit intimidating, and always fabulous. In Washington, D.C., a few years later, Peter had found a Japanese restaurant whose menu, helpfully, included English subtitles. John and I, no doubt, ordered something bland and predictable, but not so our intrepid friend. The server brought Peter's eel, yes, eel, in this ornate wooden box, which made John and me happy because we didn't have to look at the damn thing. Until, that is, Peter used his chopsticks to lift a large chunk of that slimy creature to his lips, saying with his best impression of a Monty Python character impersonating someone from Eastern Europe, "My hovercraft is filled with eels." For the younger folks, it's on YouTube. Look it up. It won't hurt you a bit. During that same trip, Peter arranged for us to eat at a Turkish restaurant. The idea was we'd have a nice dinner, get up early, walk around the monuments, and be home by dinner time. Then we saw the news. A huge snowstorm was gathering to the south, and it was predicted to drop more than a foot of snow on Washington. There would be power outages, and I-95 would be closed. So we hit the road. Fueled only by gas station hot dogs and coffee, we made it back in Florence just before dawn. I turned on the Weather Channel, only to discover that the storm, like Washington itself, had made a sharp turn to the right. Not even a flurry hit the nation's capital. We missed our dinner, but I have the memory of Peter and me in my old pickup truck barreling down the highway, listening to Beatles cassettes, yes, it was that long ago, as we thought we were outsmarting a natural disaster. Looking back at those MLA trips, there's only really one regret. We arrived in San Diego a day before the conference. The afternoon was perfect, and we seriously considered and then talked ourselves out of renting a sailboat. Sure, neither of us was certain we remembered how to sail, but what's the worst that could have happened? A scuttled boat, an expensive water rescue, drowning? It still would have been a great story. And there are lots of great stories, too many I'm afraid to share this afternoon. But I'd like to end by sharing the final text I received from Peter. It was just a few days after Helene ripped through western North Carolina, where Christine and I spend much of our time. I'd visited with Peter and Roberta a week or so before, when there still seemed to be some treatment options. On September 29th, Peter wrote, "Hi, Chris. I hope your Brevard estate didn't get swept off the mountainside. My status of play, the oncologist gives me 3 to 6 months, guesstimated. I began home hospice care this week. James is here for a visit. Your potted plant flourishes. All is well." How quintessentially Peter. He begins with concern for a friend even while sharing sad news. He remembers a tiny houseplant I gave as a gift and ends with a reassurance that all is well. All sure didn't seem well, and it still doesn't. But somehow it is. Our days are and will be a little smaller, a little darker without Peter. But our lives will always be enriched by all that he did, all that he gave, and all that he was. Somehow, all really is well. Thank you again, Roberta, Jasmine, James, John, and Jeff.
So they put me at the tag end of all the clever English professors, so I apologize up front. Merhaba, nasılsınız, hoş geldiniz. So I'm Becky Flanagan, and I had the pleasure of working alongside Peter in the English department at FMU from the time I was hired in 1995 until Peter's retirement in 2015. As you could probably gather from my poorly enunciated rudimentary Turkish introduction just now, I have been a late-to-the-party language learner. Before I started learning Turkish, I had never really tried to learn any other language, which always made me a little anxious around Peter, someone who definitely got the memo about the extraordinary cultural and linguistic benefit of language learning and practice. Not only did Peter teach these skills in the classroom, but he also encouraged others in their own learning. I always knew Peter and Roberta and the family would be interested in my own fledgling attempts at learning Turkish because that comparative transcribing spirit was at the heart of his pedagogy and the way he saw the world. Language acquisition, as he knew, breaks down barriers and helps unite others. Which takes me to Peter's academic specialty as teacher of world literature. Gossipy students always told me that there were 3 most feared academic hurdles in the literature curriculum in the old days. Dr. Linda Jacobs' brain-draining Shakespeare test, which often took 3, maybe 4 hours. My own relentless, every day, even if you had one the day before, 8:30 quizzes. But most formidable, the Peter Whelan research paper, in all caps, bolded. Students would begin getting anxious in the first week of class when he mentioned it. When I asked them why this task freaked them out so much, they'd say things like, "He requires us to think." Or most usually, I don't want to let him down. He actually thinks I know something. Peter can be daunting in that way. I must admit that I felt a bit of this same trepidation when Peter and Roberta's son James enrolled in my summer expository writing class in the program for young scholars. At the time, I could not imagine how I could teach James Whelan anything that he didn't already know. And I was a bit insecure that Peter would somehow have discovered that I liked the appropriate rigor in my courses. But you know what? Peter just wanted James to learn, and when we talked, he talked to me like a dad talks to his son's teacher. I loved that experience, not only because I had so much fun teaching James, but because I learned that Peter was just like us. But as many have already testified today, was he really? This was a man who ate sardines because he wanted to eat sardines, not because they were the last tin food in the cabinet. And he unabashedly ate them on cracker or a bit of toast, and I forgot the spinach until you reminded us of that, Ted. In the presence of others in our communal lounge in Founders Hall. As a fellow tinned fish connoisseur, I always enjoyed how often merely his eating of sardines would spark some kind of conversation. Someone might be squeamish about the strong smell, and Ted's already outed Marcia. Someone might reminisce, Chris Johnson, about his own fondness for anchovies. I would often recall eating mustardy sardines as a child with my mother. And if I found an unusual variety of sardines at Harris Teeter, I would sometimes put a tin in his mailbox. On the days he ate sardines, Peter would place himself at the end of the table and often announce to new lunchtime arrivals that he had sardines and he was not afraid to eat them. And you could almost see this as a metaphor for his commitment to community and fellowship. He wanted to be at the lunch table, and he wanted others to be comfortable, but he also wanted to be true to himself and enjoy his repast. I really enjoyed sardine days, and I miss them, as I will certainly miss Peter. Teşekkür ederim, görüşürüz. Güle güle.
My name's Kathy. I came to Hong Kong in 1997, and I graduated from FMU in 2003 with a degree in international studies. I met Peter and his family through my friends Ying and Nozomi over 20 years ago. I remember being very excited the first time I went to their house on McQueen Street. And since then, I was invited back many times on Sundays to join their breakfast, pancake breakfast, holiday celebrations, and birthday parties. The Whelans are like the families here. Back in my school days, I took Peter's world literature class. Ironically, it was the first time I took interest in the Chinese literature. So the first paper came, and it was to write an excerpt of a Greek tragedy. And I thought it was an interesting assignment. So instead of feeling stressed out every time, I actually had fun writing that. So it turned out surprisingly well. I got an A and lots of compliments. I was super, super proud of myself. So during the same semester, I started dating my husband, Jamie. So of course, I took him to meet my US family. And I remember James' judgment were particularly curious about Jamie. And I vividly remember that all of them were so happy for me. Then the second assignment came, and I cannot remember what it was. And of course, I did so well the first one, and the second one, the expectation was high. And guess what? I couldn't meet the deadline, and I had to come up with an excuse to get an extension. Actually, I got it more than one time. And I saw Jamie out. I told Peter that I was too busy dating Jamie and didn't have time for the paper. And Peter said, oh, he's a bad influence. And this is the first time Jamie ever heard about this, actually. Yeah, so as much as I wanted to do well in his class, And my second paper was a big disappointment. And I actually almost failed the class. But at least I got a husband out of it, right? Oh, Christmas is around the corner. Peter's handwritten chocolate chip pancake recipe on a very pretty Christmas paper has been on our refrigerator since I got it, like 7 years ago when we got together during Christmas time. I'm incredibly grateful to Peter and his family for welcoming me into their home and treating me like one of their own. Their kindness and hospitality made my early times in the US so much more enjoyable. I will always cherish the memories and the warmth they brought into my life. Thank you, Peter, James, Jasmine, Roberta, for having me. And lastly, if anyone wants a copy of Peter's handwritten chocolate chip pancake recipe, please let me know. I will get you a copy of that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Buffy Berry and I'm very nervous. I'm not a speaker, but for Dr. Whelan I'll do it. So John contacted me and I said, I told my husband I'm really not a speaker, but he made such an impact that I wanted to do it. So. I had a world literature class as well, so I understand what a lot of people were talking about. It was probably one of my most difficult classes ever, and I just loved his freestyle teaching. He would put us in a big circle and just start reading text and then ask us our thoughts. And I can remember being nervous then too, because you want to say the right thing to impress him and make him proud. And, some answers of mine were better than others. And some of them were better received than others. But I think the biggest laugh he had with me is my lack of map skills. Apparently, my high school did not teach map skills very well. And so when I got to his class, I constantly was putting the cities in the wrong places, even though I studied. And I remember asking him one time, in all seriousness, can you just make the water blue? I think if you could color it blue, I think I could get the cities in the right place. And y'all can imagine, he was very distraught by that comment because he loves his maps. And that idea was just crazy to him. But I did notice I started passing some map quizzes. I think he had a little bit of mercy on me because of that. And also Mike and I, my husband, we were dating then, we also got the privilege of coming to the breakfast, the pancake breakfast, a couple of times. And we really enjoyed the pancakes, but I think what I remember the most is just how much Dr. Whelan loved his family. He was so proud of you guys. And he just loved showing you off. And I remember thinking, that's just so awesome. This is such a great family. And I also remember that we would go out in the yard afterwards, and you guys had a lot of talents that we didn't know you had, which included some axe throwing and some juggling. And Mike and I were thoroughly impressed by your skills. And James and Jasmine were young then. Mike and I were saying, we think you were about 15 maybe at the time, and you were showing us some of your karate skills. And we left very impressed with your family and totally enjoyed it. And the last memory I really want to share is someone spoke about, I'm so sorry, I just took something out, I'm so sorry. Sorry, hope Dr. Whelan's laughing somewhere. But you guys made the trip to my wedding, all the way in Brevard, a pretty place, up in Greenville. And my husband and I got to the part where we're supposed to cut the cake. And we're standing there, and I'm looking at this multi-layered cake. It was cake and flowers, not the easiest, cake to cut. And we're standing there, and no one will help us cut this cake. And I'm looking at this cake thinking, I don't know what to do. And I think Dr. Whelan saw my panic because he actually stood up and said, I will cut the cake. And so I actually have pictures here, and this is Dr. Whelan cutting the cake. And he's got on his chili pepper tie. And I just love that. And so I found these pictures, and I'm always grateful for him. I'm grateful for what he taught me. I'm grateful for him sharing what a family really looks like and how much you should love your children and how you should treat your family. And I'm thankful for everything he taught me. And I'm a teacher now, but as you can see, I don't teach in front of great amounts of people. I teach visually impaired students, one student at a time. And I bring in literature because I teach magnification skills, some Braille skills, and I like to bring in literature from all different places to work with my students, and I think about him when I do that. So anyway, thank you all for having me. Sorry I'm so nervous, but I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope it makes him proud. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Philip Kwan. I'm a physician here, but I knew Peter as a cyclist more than anything else. We all knew Peter as a husband and a father, an educator and a friend. I just want to thank Roberta, Jasmine, and James for letting me speak about his most important role as a cyclist. Peter loved riding. He loved eating a post-race meal and the enhanced flavors induced by moderate to marked hypoglycemia. He, like many of us, returned home after even the longest of rides, invigorated and ready to be an active member of the household all day long. Confirmation, Roberta. Truly, he had a passion for cycling in a way that many of the individuals here understand. I only knew Peter since moving here in 2016, and so there are many people I see in all locations who have ridden with him maybe even longer than I have, but that said, between shorter local rides, Tuesday night worlds, and long Wednesday, Saturday, or Sunday rides, I was fortunate enough to spend thousands of miles in the saddle with Peter along with many of the fellow cyclists here today. This may say more about me than Peter, but in those hundreds of hours and thousands of miles, riding often in a silent, shared cadence, outside of my wife and children, Peter really became my best friend here in South Carolina. Because of our relative ages while riding together, of those miles, he spent many of them on my rear wheel. He benefited from the controlled, proximate, and mostly limited danger of sitting on my wheel, and was subject to my profuse dripping, windborne sweat, snot rockets, and rainy day rooster tails among many of cycling's other intimacies. I still remember how happy he was the first time I made it my specific goal of the day to lead him out for the finish sprint over here on Pocket Road. Peter on my wheel was overwhelmingly our arrangement while on the bike. That said, he seemed to have particular pride and almost glowing joy when the roles would be reversed after I would completely crack, and he would drag me home on the bike with me forced to tell him to just back it down a little. As I heard from others while preparing this, there were two other cyclists. There were two, probably the most common themes: their enjoyment of riding with Peter and the optimistic example and hope that he was for all of us. Riding, not just out meandering or noodling on a bike, but riding, into his 70s. We should be so lucky to continue to reap the joy, fitness, and camaraderie that comes with bridging the gap, making the selection, sharing the suffering, and being there for the final sprint. On weekends and summer days, we would get up early for long rides, topping out at around 100 miles or so to beat some of the South Carolina, or to get up early to beat some of the South Carolina peak summer heat topping out at over 100 degrees. On other occasions, Peter and some of the diehards would get up early, drive over to my place by 3 or 4 in the morning, and we would load up the van and go ride some of the mountains up around Travelers Rest, where the Hincapie Gran Fondo takes place each year. Peter would take a little perverse pleasure at times enjoying announcing the early starts to Jay, who, not always a fan of the early starts, communicating to Jay that those rides would leave at Sparrow's Fart. Jay now includes that phrase whenever appropriate and noted his doing so is spreading the word of Peter. Now, Jay, if Peter has any say in it, Peter will be gently haunting you for the mildly biblical phrasing of spreading the word of Peter. Johnny Mitchell, a relative local legend, in his typical smooth and socially dexterous manner, shared how he met Peter when Peter was already old at the time. But he said he remembered thinking that the Florence ride could not be that good if this guy could keep up. That was the first of many times that Peter surprised him. He loved Peter's commitment to cycling. He wanted to celebrate Peter's tenacity as a cyclist almost as much as his kind-hearted nature as a person. One of the highest honors one can bestow on a fellow cyclist, in my opinion, is to be considered one of the hard men of cycling. Isabel, Ella, Hannah, no gender limitations implied. A hard man is a rider who demonstrates the exceptional toughness, perseverance, and aggression, often pushing themselves to the limit in harsh conditions, refusing to back down from challenges where they can withstand brutal terrain and weather, at times essentially grinding their competitors into submission. I noticed that quality also translated into academia at times. Peter had some, if not all, of those characteristics. The ability to suffer, push through pain and fatigue without giving up. I can't remember who else was with us that day, but I remember looking at Peter on one of those long rides, and this time he had completely cracked, and his entire body and bike were listing over to one side to such a degree that we were concerned about him approaching the limits of what physics would allow. When I rode up beside him to ask if he was okay, he wordlessly communicated through dried salt and spit-covered lips that his mind was doing no better in that moment. That said, he was still resolute in continuing the pace. Aggressive racing style. Peter took great pride in riding with and often finishing ahead of riders decades his junior. It frustrated him when he missed the lead group, and he would, mostly mockingly, berate those of us that at times blew it up open super early if that proved to his disadvantage. It brought him joy when he read the race correctly and was able to hold a wheel or use others to his benefit in Tuesday Night Worlds and finish up with the front group. Thriving in tough conditions, such as performing well in cobblestone, steep climbs, and bad weather. Well, he climbed well, and he toughed out many cold winter rides. As for the cobblestones, rough terrain part, I was never quite able to convince Peter of the joys of gravel and mountain biking. In trying to put together rides of up to 100 miles around here while minimizing significant motorized traffic, I would occasionally add in brief gravel sections as connectors, which immediately elicited muttering and sometimes mild cursing of me as he was concerned for both his bike and his own safety. Those rides would seem to always fall on days where he'd just cleaned his bike and lubed the chain, so I was already in trouble before he even hit the sector. Admittedly, his concerns were not entirely baseless, as on an otherwise hard packed gravel, maybe 1/32 of a mile that was smoother and more solid than some asphalt, Peter uncannily did seem to find that single foot or two of soft sand and would at times go down on a section which I thought was wholly safe to include. the mental fortitude of a hard man, strong mental resilience to overcome adversity and stay focused during a race. I think this is a characteristic obvious even to those of you who never rode with him. A hard man is often recognized for their fighting spirit and tenacity, even when not in contention for victory. A hard man has the ability to do a huge amount of work that would kill a lesser human, but brings a smile to the face of a flahoot. That's the hard men of hard men. I saw these features of Peter the cyclist, the hard man, even in the last weeks of his life when he was still trying to be in service of others in the limited capacities left to him. And Peter has now, unfortunately, arrived at kilometer 137 of life. Cycling reference there, the rider. But I hope you all can see how and I think many of his cyclists will always think of him as one of Florence's true hard men of cycling. Thank you, Peter.
Tough acts to follow. I'm Dave Olmsted. I'm Roberta's brother and Peter's brother-in-law. Whew. So when Meredith was talking about sardines, I remember Pete often asking me if I wanted a beer and sardines. And it's like, yes to the beer, no to the sardines. Didn't stop him from asking. And when Chris was talking about MLA, it was like every holiday when Pete would take off and go to the MLA. And I thought I could do this, and I will. But he's a good man. But Pete definitely did not want a somber or sad event to celebrate his life. He wanted this to be more of a roast than a memorial. With that in mind, I will do my best to share what a great guy he was. As I thought back through all the fun and the funny moments and events, to pick one or two, it was kind of difficult. I have to admit I was a bit skeptical when my sister told me that she had fallen for this itinerant British lecturer that showed up in Kenton College. But it certainly was was happy that she had found someone that she cared for and would ultimately get married to. I have to go for the glasses on this one. But through the years, I learned that Pete would not be the brother-in-law who would join me in manly projects like home improvements or auto repair. But when I needed someone to explain to me just what the heck a runcible spoon was, or someone who had the skill to translate Monty Python into ancient Hebrew, he was my go-to guy. After they were married, Robert and Pete went to Jordan to where he taught at the university there. And in the summers, they would come to my house in Ohio. And it was there I learned how jealous Pete could be. During one of those visits when James was little, and my first golden retriever, Opus, he and James became fast friends. I think it was all the crackers that James would sort of give over the side. And when it came time for James to say his first words, it was not dad or dada, it was dog. I think Pete eventually forgave Opus for usurping his son's first spoken word, but it took a while. And as time progressed, I became sort of an academic advisor for Pete. During those semesters when he had to teach freshman composition, I would often catch him grading freshman comp papers when I called. Since I'm the caring and helpful person that I am, I offered my best accountant advice on what to look for in a good composition and methods to speed the grading process. Sadly, he seemed to seldom take my advice to heart. The best piece of advice I ever gave him was to assign an essay with the subject being arbitrary and capricious, and give the students whatever the heck grade he wanted. It made perfect sense to me, but like so many good pieces of advice I offered, it also fell by the wayside. But while he may have ignored my academic advice, he consistently demonstrated great judgment in life. He married my sister. He was a great father and a great friend, colleague, teacher, and mentor. So in conclusion, I will fall back on advice that I received from my freshman composition teacher years ago. Tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Tell them. Start your last paragraph with, in conclusion, and end it with a period. Period.
Now, when Jasmine asked me if I had completed my speech yet, I told her that I was going to write 3 speeches, and depending on the tone of the occasion, I would just give the one that fit the best. One of the speeches was about my father participating in important life events of some of the people in this room. One was about his love of athletics, and the third one was almost entirely about sardines. So I will set aside my notes and speak from the heart. And Father would want me specifically to thank John Tuttle for doing this on his behalf. It would have meant a lot that you were the one to put this together. John was one of the first friends that our family made when we moved to town. And he was a really good get as a friend because despite the fact he was an academic, he had the self-confidence to own a red pickup truck. And also the self-confidence to dress in, I believe, a southwestern fringe leather jacket and giant turquoise talismans. But it may be my memory exaggerating because at that age, you don't apprehend things the same way that you do as an adult. And also, people look at you differently. This came to a head when John came by the house, and I wasn't sure if I was allowed to talk to him because he was an adult I'd only seen a couple of times. He was like, "What's wrong with you? Don't you recognize me?" And I jokingly said, "Well, how could I? You're one of those people that looks like everyone else." But what I didn't appreciate until much later is that when you're 4, people don't expect that type of sarcasm from you, and they tend to take everything that you say literally, which I'm glad I got that off my chest. John was wonderful. It was really like many times my father was Richie, and it was the Fonz coming to drop in and help us move something with his amazing vehicle. Not just in the first house, but also into the second house. I'd also like to thank everybody who went from academia and then went on to serve in the administration. This is something that my father would have found incredibly painful, but if it hadn't been done by such wonderful people, I would not have had the childhood that I had, or possibly any childhood, because the frustration and rage of poor administration would have woken in my father's heart, might have turned him from the compassionate man that we're celebrating today into, some combination of Guy Fawkes and Che Guevara at minimum. So the only thing I will talk about, and I felt this again watching you guys, because you have all been like a mirror that I've been able to understand my father through over the years, because he was not someone to talk about himself, especially in sort of descriptive, emotional terms. But what I came to understand about him through you guys was his humility and his compassion. And that might seem strange, based on the fact that we've all been talking about how he would force people to smell whatever type of fish he wanted to eat, and then in great humility make fun of people's rejection letters, even standing in the hallway and making up elaborate mythology about John being repeatedly rejected and never having his plays performed, as of course they were. I've seen it at least once with my own eyes. But he was also somebody who, despite the fact that people would come to him expecting him to know things, would never pretend to know anything that he didn't feel that he knew. And if he said something to you, he went and looked it up after the fact. Over the course of my childhood, I constantly was waiting for him to, just out of politeness, at least pretend he saw a television show or watched a documentary that someone had recommended that he watched, or pretend if he couldn't remember the last syllable of the name of the Yanomami tribe, which was a lot less well known at the time, he might have just made it up, sort of guessed what the final vowel would be. But if he didn't know how to say something or didn't know a piece of information, he would just say they didn't know it. And that was a major part of his humility, and it was part of the strength of character that I didn't receive it innately, but it's something that I've been striving towards. So to all my martial arts friends who I'm going to send this video to, I have not watched the first season of True Detective. And to all of those of you who I recommended it to, I was laughing inside. Which is not good and demonstrates a lack of compassion, which my father had a great deal more than I do. He helped people a lot, and I grew up with a sense that one of the great things about being an academic is that you had the freedom and the flexibility that when you saw something in the world that wasn't right, you could say something about it and do something about it. And, I obviously won't mention any names, but if he saw anyone who was in despair, he was there to help by spending time with you or attempting to give you free pancakes. That recipe that Kathy has, by the way, was written using the Egyptian Book of the Dead as a support surface. So it was, and I think Jamie noted this at the time, but the recipe was written on the back of the Egyptian Book of the Dead during my father's late career hieroglyphics phase. And in his humility, he had no interest in publishing this on YouTube or making any bigger of a deal about it than essentially giving help to people on an individual basis. I once discovered somehow that over the course of his life, I think during his weekend or during his workouts and during his lunch breaks, he had acquired the ability to hold his breath for 4 minutes. And I pointed out to him that this was I measured this in somewhere around 2010. If he had wanted to combine that with his hieroglyphic skills to say he developed a method of holding his breath, he could make a couple $1,000s a month just on YouTube sticking his head in a bucket of water. And he didn't want to do it. But the other thing was, as he was helping people, he was doing this not out of an attempt to aggrandize himself or to involve himself in something interesting or to show that he was special in some way. He was doing it because he didn't want other people to suffer. It's a slightly darker story, but throughout my childhood, my father at one point heard about, forgive me, the medical men in the audience, Nagranja fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. It's common in freshwater bodies of water, and you have approximately the same chance of getting your brain eaten by it as you do of being struck by lightning tonight. But my father would always remind me, don't aspirate any fresh water in Texas, because the combination of global warming and the presence of this amoeba and life being what it is, you'll end up with a fever, seizures, and then instant death. About a year ago, almost exactly, that happened to a friend of mine. And I missed him dearly, but I thought, I have to tell Father about this, because there'll be a certain amount of schadenfreude, a certain amount of whatever that smug emotion is, where someone on the television comes up and says, I predicted that the economy would crash. It did. I said the market was overheated. And now just look at all those people who are homeless or have signs up in front of their house. Yay me. But my father didn't see the humor at all. His only emotion was sadness that someone had suffered, and the sincere hope that that wouldn't happen to anyone he knew or anyone at all. And that is a part of his character that I'm still striving to emulate, and I appreciate the opportunity to have another look at his character through what all of you have said today. Thank you very much.
James Whelan, a hard act to follow since March of 1990. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you to John and everyone who's spoken. As you were speaking, I was reminded of so many moments from my dad's last weeks. But if I tried now to tell you how much that text banter meant to my dad, or how many times Dad referenced Kathy's incredible paper in his mythology class, I would lose it. So I'm just going to go with what I've written. Forgive me. The first iteration of the Google search engine was launched in 1998. And while it turned out that humanity would wind up using what could have been a civilization-altering tool for the betterment of humanity to just search for YouTube videos supporting flat Earth conspiracy theories and disturbingly niche adult content, for a brief shining moment, it really felt like a conduit had been opened between your average American living room and all of the knowledge in the known universe. Within a decade, it had become bad form to interrupt someone else's day to ask a question that was easily Googleable. You may remember that wildly and self-avowedly passive-aggressive website, Let Me Google That For You, which was created solely to shame the question asker for this particular breach of social etiquette by sending them a video of an unseen entity typing their query into the Google search bar and then displaying the results. I was studying for the GRE around the time that we had collectively decided that it was bad form to use other human beings as a primary source of reference material. And in one of those inevitable moments of clarity about how completely you've been taking your parents for granted your whole life, I asked my dad for the definition of a word and then immediately apologized. I'm sorry, I probably should have Googled how to use insouciance in a sentence. Of course, Dad assured me that he didn't mind, and then he admitted somewhat sheepishly that he missed the way his colleagues and students used to pop into his office to ask these now Googleable questions. Because before those Stanford PhD students invented Google, the closest thing that many of us had to a conduit to all of the knowledge in the known universe was Peter Whelan. And he saw each of our questions more as a gift, or at least an even trade. One on-demand lecture on a topic of your choosing in exchange for the pleasure of an enthusiastic audience as he heaved the dusty tome off the bottom of an overstuffed bookshelf and traced the expansion and decline of an ancient civilization over the pages of a historical atlas, or delivered a spirited reading of the Robert Burns poem whose title you couldn't quite remember in a heavy Scottish brogue. My dad never saw an opportunity to share his knowledge as a waste of time, and as James recalled, he never once pretended to know an answer when he didn't. In fact, he was always excited to look up an answer for you in real time, and ever ready to deftly pluck the necessary book from the solid wall of bookshelves that lined his office and several rooms of our house. My mom may have had to locate his glasses and keys for him more than once a day for the entire duration of their marriage. But even when his voice and eyesight were failing him, just days before he died, he could still direct me to the exact location of the collection of Robert Browning's poetry that contained The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Praxed's Church. Mom and I leaned in closely as he whispered the dying words of a corrupt old bishop instructing his illegitimate sons how to hoard his wealth after his death. My father, ever the world's greatest reader of bedtime stories, using the incapacity of his illness to lend nuance and realism to his interpretation. As every member of my nuclear family, and I will wager many of his friends and colleagues here assembled can attest, my father's generosity with this knowledge could very occasionally be a double-edged sword. You may note strong emphasis on may. It is very unlikely that any of you did note that his obituary neglected to list Old Occitan, the language of medieval troubadour lyric poetry, in the litany of languages he had mastered. This omission occurred for no other reason than my personal guilt. Over the summer, Dad spent painstakingly translating canso after tenso of troubadour love poetry, wandering the halls of our house after every stanza or two to deliver first the original and then the translated verses, often with optional alternate translations to whichever hapless member of our family he might meet first. I hope and I believe that Dad never suspected that after a week or so, my mom and I began scurrying through the doors and hallways of our home like Scooby-Doo villains evading capture, unable to manifest enthusiasm for the subtle yet masterful changes between his fourth and fifth draft translation of one of Bernard de Ventador's expressions of courtly love. Jorge Luis Borges said, "When writers die, they become books, which is, after all, not too bad an incarnation." This is a quote I selected chiefly because the famed Argentinian poet once mistook my dad for a native Spanish speaker at a conference, a fact which I feel strongly that Dad would have wanted you all to know, but which I could not quite find a way to shoehorn into the obituary. Honest to a fault, Dad pointed out in almost the same breath that Borges was blind by the time they met. This explains how my dad's face and nose and ears did not tip Borges off as to my dad's true nationality immediately. Still, however self-serving the selection, the Borges quote made me think. Dad did not consider himself a writer, although beyond his published book and magisterial Samson and Delilah paper, I would propose he deserved that title solely on the merit of the comically outraged letter of complaint he once penned to Ghirardelli about a decrease in the cocoa content of their chocolate chips, which left our whole family weeping on the floor with laughter and earned us 2 free bags of chocolate chips as compensation. So he did not think of himself as a writer, but he did identify as a teacher. And if writers become the books they wrote, perhaps teachers become the lessons they taught, the ideas they shared, the voice in our heads distinguishing a calyx from an amphora as we stroll through a museum, the Scottish accent we hear in our mind every time we read a Burns poem. The exhortations reading in our ears to never stop reading good books, and for God's sake to look up the words we don't understand. The last is the most important. There were few educational causes dearer to my father's heart than finally convincing his students to look up the words they didn't know. If you happen to have one on hand, you can try searching out those definitions for yourself when appropriate in a dusty 3-volume Oxford English Dictionary. I presume this was my dad's preferred method of looking up new words based on the amount of space they took up on his bookshelves, although no matter how hard we tried over the years to stump him, James and I never succeeded in actually finding a word in any of those volumes that Dad didn't already know. But I think my father, usurped as he may have sometimes felt by the rise of the internet search engine, would not mind if you used Google. I think he would just hope, although he'd never utter such a sentimentality out loud, that you hold on to this newfound knowledge, that you share it unselfishly when the opportunity arises, that in this way you leave little pieces of yourself behind in the people lucky enough to know you, just as we will all carry my dad with us, in the lessons and the jokes and the ideas and the words that he shared with all of us. Thank you.
I'm Joangela Edwins, and I worked with Peter for 11 years. And Peter was always a joy to see in the hallways, even in the lunchroom with his sardines. Often I would step out of my office, and here would come Peter around the corner, smiling brightly, bouncing down the hall, and he would say, "What ho, Joangela?" And I'd say, "What did you call me?" And once he was walking down the hall, and I must have been frowning, and he said something like, "Your brow is wrinkled." I was probably grading. And I said, "Yes, I hope it's not wrinkled too badly." And about that time, Chris Johnson comes out of his office. And Peter says, "Well, at least it's not nearly as wrinkled as Chris Johnson's shirt." Has he just given up ironing? So Peter just had a way to make your day brighter. And I adored Peter, hated to see him retire, and I hated to get the news that he'd passed away. I was going to see him just a few days before, and he wasn't well, and I didn't get a chance to see him. And I do hate that. But I'm incredibly grateful to Roberta and Jasmine and James for asking me to write a poem in his memory. Like a Peter Whelan research paper, this was a hard assignment. And I'm going to read it now. The title is Sapientia, which is Latin for wisdom, and unlike Peter, I had to look that up. Learned friend, you left us that time of year when the day bends to darkness, when leaves flutter from trees and spin in winds gone chill, leaves that remind some of us of pages turning in 1,000 books in 100 different languages. And I think of you, smiling, strolling long halls, whispering tongues that too few of us speak. Once I rounded a corner and you startled me, long branch in hand topped with a perfect pine cone the shape of a hive or old world battle crown. And yes, you looked the part of a cheerful king. Ever the teacher, you explained exactly how that scepter signaled fertility to the ancients. Ever the addled student, I've forgotten most of what you told me, but not the vibrant glow in your eyes as you offered your lecture freely to a colleague standing by chance between trash can and pencil sharpener. And this, as you well knew, was how learning happened. All of a sudden, whenever two or more gathered anywhere, park bench, coffee shop, classroom, in the name of connection, in the name of receptivity, in the name of peace and love, which is to say, in the name of the closest thing we get to God, that man whose wise face and white beard might well have been the face of a teacher, the music of all languages dancing from his throat, stern in his lessons, but always gentle in the hand that lifted the light, touched the heart, turned the page. Wherever you are now, your eyes must still glow to see how those who learn from you carry what you taught into new seasons. Watch them turn the leaves. Watch them gather pine cones and the long fingers of oak. Watch them cross doorways into new rooms where they speak to new students all the words they need to hear.
I'm not going to say anything else. That concludes the program. Thank you to those of you who read. Thank you to those of you who came. I think the best tribute we could make right now to Peter is to go wipe out the buffet.